Millions of people visit the Colosseum every single year, drawn to the sheer scale, the history, and the raw ambition of Roman engineering. But back in its prime, this place wasn't just a monument to give back to the Roman people. Here, hundreds of thousands of people were killed through public executions, gladiator combat, and even wild animal hunts, designed for maximum spectacle. Masses of Romans packed into the stands to watch the bloodshed, roaring as the violence played out below them. But now some say that those crowds never really left. People report seeing glimpses of thousands of spectators, and the unmistakable feeling like they're being watched by an audience that isn't really there. Because while the fighting ended centuries ago, that energy never really left. So, right up top, in case you hadn't figured just yet, this one is gonna be dark. You know I love covering the dark history before getting into the ghost stories, but there is just so much to say about the Colosseum, for obvious reasons. So if you're okay with getting particularly gruesome, I'll carry on. But the story of the place really starts before it was even built, as there's a bit of a scandal involved. It's how all the best haunted history stories start, let's be honest. But basically, back in AD 64, there was a horrendous fire that absolutely decimated the city of Rome over the course of about 9 days. We don't know the exact figure, but it's thought that hundreds of people died and thousands more were left homeless. Just absolute carnage. After the fire was put out and plans were put in place to start rebuilding the city, the Emperor Nero, he carved out a patch of land that he wanted to build something for himself on. It was to be his new luxury palace, known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. And as if a sprawling palace built on the site of what used to be ordinary Roman citizens' homes and businesses wasn't enough, he had a massive bronze statue of himself built on the grounds too. Some people actually suspected the emperor of starting the fire so that it could clear the ground that he needed, or at the very least he exploited the disaster to his own ends. But it's just kind of hearsay, just rumours. But either way, a few years after that, things kind of descended into chaos and Nero ended up taking his own life in AD 68. Following the emperor's death, because there was no clear successor, there was a whole lot of fighting, civil wars and all of that. And I mean, it was literally called the Year of the Four Emperors, to give you an idea, until Vespasian emerged as the new emperor in AD 69. But knowing the state of Rome at the time and just how precarious his situation was as the new emperor, he wanted to get the public on side as soon as possible. And so he made plans to build a huge amphitheatre right on the site of where Nero's palace had been, specifically where the artificial lake had been put in. Construction started around AD 70 to 72, somewhere around there, and it was originally named the Flavian Amphitheatre because they were living in the Flavian dynasty. But it would become known as the Colosseum over time, with some theories saying that the statue of Nero that he'd put up was just known as the Colossus, and so the building close by became the Colosseum. The logic kind of tracks, I can see it. I feel like the Colosseum is a better name for this place anyway. The thing is huge. It sits on 6 acres, towering 150 feet high, just absolutely massive. But it is worth saying, and absolutely relevant to mention, that the only way that Vespasian could afford to finance such a project was on the, quote, spoils of war from the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, alongside the 60 to 100,000 Jewish prisoners of war who were forced into back-breaking slavery to build the amphitheatre. So before the place was even opened up, you've got that kind of history going on here. Yeah, not gonna be a nice one today. But Emperor Vespasian wouldn't live to see the Colosseum finished, as he died on the 23rd of June AD 79. His son Titus succeeded him though, and the year after, in AD 80, the Colosseum's construction was complete. And there's no better way to officially open an amphitheatre like this one than having 100 days of games, right? Oh yeah, here we go, we are getting into it now. All of the things that the Romans loved to watch on a nice day out. Lots of death in absolutely horrific ways, but also animal cruelty, so if you don't want to hear about that, this is your warning. Because at the Colosseum, it would be a full day packed with things going on in the arena. 50,000 up to possibly 80,000 people would pile into the Colosseum, screaming for blood, roaring at every kill, eyes locked on the arena floor at the carnage below. Not an iPhone inside, everyone just living in the moment. The games would start off in the morning when the wild animals would be let loose. These would be all manner of wild exotic beasts that had been shipped in from around the Roman Empire. Lions, bears, elephants, rhinos, wolves, crocodiles, even giraffes, ostriches, apes, shapes, like just all sorts. And in some of these shows, the arena would be mocked up to resemble their natural habitat with trees, hiding places and whatnot. And then hunters would go into the arena to hunt these wild animals who had been starved. Sometimes these were highly skilled, well-trained guys, but other times it would be the condemned, prisoners to be executed. So yeah, you can imagine how well that went for them. Other games would see wild animals pitted against each other, so there would be things like a rhino versus an elephant versus a bull, a lion versus a tiger. And this part actually made me feel sick. It's so horrific, but sometimes the animals were apparently chained together, so they couldn't get away from each other, so they would just fight. Absolutely appalling. Once the animal-related entertainment had gone down an absolute storm with the bloodthirsty crowd, around lunchtime, that would be the time for the public executions. Because similarly to other places and time periods, executions were performed publicly as a form of a deterrent. Basically, show people the consequences of breaking the law, don't step out of line, or you could be the matinee show at the Colosseum next week. But it wasn't just criminals, prisoners of war, and even Christians would be executed at the Colosseum. Like the infamous story of Ignatius of Antioch, a Christian bishop who was martyred when he was thrown to the lions. And these executions, they were obviously designed to be pretty brutal, they had a whole crowd to please, but they did get scarily creative with it. They used to put on recreations of Greek mythology and get the condemned prisoner to play out the deaths in real life. They might be mauled by animals or burned to death or even catapulted across the arena in a bit too literal of a retelling of Icarus flying too close to the sun. And none of these ways sound like a nice way to go, really. But I don't know, there's one that was particularly terrifying to think about, and it was when criminals would be forced to fight the gladiators. You know, those highly trained, skilled fighters. So you're there, armed with nothing but maybe a crappy sword or something, and you have this hulking great big gladiator coming towards you. So that also went about as well as you can imagine. Just going up against a gladiator, knowing that you're not leaving that arena alive. Like, this guy's sole purpose right now is to end you. Unimaginable. And once the deed was done, your body had been dragged out of the arena with the crowd barely even remembering your name. It was time for the real show. Because yeah, the executions, events where countless people lost their life, that was just the warm-up, the lunchtime performance. It's just the callousness for me, the utter dehumanization. Your life snuffed out for sports and barely anyone blinked. Because the main attraction was the afternoon headliners. They were who the crowd were really there to see, the gladiator fights. Yeah, the more I researched into this one, the worse it got. But gladiator fights, right from the get-go, I need to dispel the myth that these were all fights to the death. They weren't. Gladiators dying wasn't as common as a lot of people think. Because these guys, they were celebrities of their time. They were highly trained, their owners invested huge amounts of money in training them. So it would be bad for business if you had to train up a new guy every week. A lot of gladiators were slaves or, again, prisoners of war or condemned criminals who were fighting for their freedom. But there were also free men who went after the life of a gladiator for the shot at all of the money and fame that you could earn if you were good enough, and more importantly, popular enough with the crowd. Because successful gladiators, who had the people on their side, you were a big deal. That was about as good as it got for you. And so gladiator fights would usually be to first blood, or if a gladiator yielded. But you still had to be careful. Don't put on a good enough show and the crowd could still turn on you. And as the whole point of the Colosseum games were to keep the people happy, the emperor could order you to be killed. Just what a career though. Your life hanging not just on your opponent's sword, but also on the emperor's decision and the mood of a bloodthirsty crowd. This is scary. There were also other events too that happened at the Colosseum, including allegedly actual naval battle recreations. And I say allegedly because people argue online about how they would actually flood the Colosseum to be able to have these battles take place. There was a drainage system below the building that supposedly would have been able to fill and drain the arena within a couple of hours. and there were historical accounts of these naval battles taking place in the Colosseum. But whether it was actually to the scale that they were reported, we don't really know. Maybe they were just smaller boats, maybe, for a theatrical, yet still bloody splash, rather than all-out naval warfare, you know what I mean? Plus, a lot of people mention that the Hypogeum, the network of tunnels and things that ran underneath the arena floor, that was built after the Colosseum opened. So surely any naval battle that took place would have had to have been before that. Otherwise, you'd have drowned all of your gladiators and wild animals that were down there. So yeah, the debate is still ongoing as to whether these naval battles actually took place. And I think the mainstream consensus is that if they did, it would have happened in the earlier years of the Colosseum opening, maybe even just the opening games. But for hundreds of years, the Colosseum would have been buzzing with all of this activity, all of these thousands of people flocking to watch these brutal and often fatal shows. The atmosphere at one of these things would have been like nothing else. The roaring of the crowd, the heat beating down on you, the smell of blood and sweat in the air, which wouldn't have even come close to what it would have been like for the people involved in these events, down in the Hypogeum, the space underneath the arena floor lit only by oil lamps, with all of the wild animals caged up down there, along with their fear and inevitable excrement, condemned prisoners knowing that today will be their last, and even gladiators, their tomorrow wasn't promised either. A bad injury or a crowd judgment, and that was it for them too. The point I'm trying to get at here is that at the Colosseum, during those centuries where these brutal games were being held, nothing could come close to the energy and the emotion within the amphitheatre. Eventually though, hosting this entertainment became more and more expensive. They'd hunted some wild animals to extinction. There'd been that many rounded up and killed in the name of putting on a show. But also, there was a societal shift towards Christianity, which condemned these games as being immoral. And so these horrific blood sports, even gladiator battles where things were somewhat more evenly matched, they were declining in popularity. In 404, gladiator fights were officially banned, with games involving wild animals winding down before they were axed as well. After AD 523, there were no more records of any other events being held at the Colosseum, and so after almost 450 years, its days of being effectively a public killing machine had come to an end. Estimates do seem to vary quite a lot, but it's thought that around 500,000 people lost their lives at the Colosseum, and over 1 million wild animals had been slaughtered for entertainment here, which is just a ridiculous number to think about, just so much death. And although it had served as this go-to destination for Roman citizens for so long, once the events were over, the place was pretty much largely abandoned. The stones and metals that it was made out of were scavenged and used for other buildings, and the structure did suffer damage from earthquakes and things like that. It was thought to have been briefly used as a castle when the Frangipani family moved in and fortified it in the 1200s, but in the 14th century it again had become largely forgotten by the public, save for being home to a few bandits and things like that. The outer south side completely collapsed in 1349 after a massive earthquake, leaving us with the shape of the Colosseum that we know today, with that huge chunk missing. But all during this time, while it didn't really have a significant role to play in the city of Rome, it wasn't completely forgotten about. It was a super important site for Christianity, being a place where at least some early Christians had been martyred by being stoned, crucified, eaten by animals, and burned alive. They were also martyred elsewhere in Rome too, it wasn't just the Colosseum, but in the 18th century, Pope Benedict XIV consecrated it as a site of martyrdom. And while all of this was done with the intention to protect the building from its condition worsening, you can't really stop the march of time. So by the 20th century, weather, neglect, vandalism, earthquakes had all taken a toll, destroying what had once been the marble seating and decorative embellishments from around the amphitheatre. But even nowadays, it's still one of the most recognisable spots in Rome. You just see a picture of it and you know exactly what it is. And so unsurprisingly, it is now a hugely popular tourist attraction, with something like 7 million visitors each year. And it's also now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so it is legally protected. It has to be maintained and cared for. So it shouldn't decay any further and should still hopefully be around for future generations to visit and learn about the brutal, gruesome history that happened here. But it's one thing to hear the tour guide's story or read about the Colosseum's history in a textbook. It's another thing entirely to come face to face with that history, looking just as real as if you'd stepped back in time to show day at the Colosseum. Because the ancient site is said to be extremely haunted. Visitors and staff claim to hear disembodied noises or flash images of another millennia altogether. But some see the unmistakable figures of people, looking just as real, as solid as you or me. What may come as a surprise to absolutely nobody is that ghostly gladiators have been seen wandering around the Colosseum. They're said to be dressed in their armour, or lack thereof, depending on which class of gladiator they were, and they have a seemingly very stoic, very resolute demeanour about them, totally calm, unshakable. And when you consider how these guys were trained, while death was always a possibility in every single one of their fights, they were trained on how to have a good death. I don't think they feared death. Couple that with just how many would have died or sustained fatal injuries at the Colosseum, regardless of the fact that most weren't supposed to be a fight to the death, you can see why these chaps are still seen around the building. But there's one so-called gladiator said to haunt the Colosseum who stands out from the rest, mostly because he also happened to be an emperor, so there's that. But also, thinking about it, calling him a gladiator might be a bit of a stretch. Anyway, you may recognise him as Joaquin Phoenix's character from Gladiator. Yep, Commodus. Emperor Commodus ruled from AD 180 to 192, and as if being emperor wasn't enough, he quite fancied being a gladiator as well. Now, I don't know if you know this, but when your fearless leader of the entire Empire of Rome wants to play with sharp metal implements with the intent to wound or kill, you've kind of got to make sure that he doesn't end up getting wounded or killed himself. And so Commodus was possibly the most successful gladiator of all time, but it had nothing to do with having access to the best training that the Empire had to offer. It was because he couldn't be allowed to die, obviously. It was thought that opponents would be secretly injured just before the fight in ways that could be hidden under their armour, but would still render them absolutely useless, and so they couldn't win against Commodus. Sadly, the same went for animals too. They would be injured before a fight, or he'd just be standing on a platform and shoot at them from a safe distance, like fish in a barrel or lions in a Colosseum against Emperor Commodus. But his quote-unquote fighting days, and his ruling days in general, would come to an end when he was assassinated on the 31st of December 192. He was actually poisoned, but threw up the poison before it could work, and so after surviving that attempt, went to have a nice relaxing bath. I think you've earned it after surviving an assassination attempt, right? But while he was in the bath, he was strangled to death by his personal trainer, Narcissus. But it seems that Commodus has returned to a place that he clearly seemed to love in life, as the figure of a man wearing very regal clothing has been seen. And witnesses describe the atmosphere around this entity as very arrogant and quite menacing, actually. Like, clearly, this is a man who knows he's very important, and so you should know it too. But aside from the wannabe gladiator and the actual gladiators said to still be haunting the Colosseum, there is another entity who, instead of performing in the arena, actually protected the arena. People report that a phantom sentry appears at night once the gates are shut to the public, and he's just standing guard over the Colosseum just as he would have centuries ago. But it's not just men. The apparitions of women have also been seen in the Colosseum, because women were actually allowed to attend the games, but just sitting way up in the nosebleeds. Some believe that these ghostly women could be the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, home and family. And these priestesses would have attended the Colosseum given their elite status in Roman society, because people have described seeing the apparitions of women wearing white robes drifting through the amphitheatre, accompanied by the faint, sweet smell of incense. So Vestal Virgins, being priestesses, would have worn white robes to symbolise their purity and their sacred duty, but more than likely also smelled of incense. But others believe that this female presence is in fact just one woman in particular, Valeria Messalina. She was the third wife of Emperor Claudius, infamous in her own time for her promiscuous reputation, but also her political scheming, which is what got her executed when she was just 23 years old in AD 48. But she's mostly seen around the area of the Colosseum in general, particularly what's left of the Temple of Claudius, just to the south of the amphitheatre, as a woman wearing white again. So some people believe that it wouldn't be a stretch to say that this woman in white within the Colosseum could also be Messalina. Although, gotta point out, she died before the Colosseum was even built, built, so, possibly not her, unless she's just continuing to haunt the same area, regardless of what gets built around her. But then an entity who's much younger at the Colosseum, and much sadder, is said to be the daughter of a gladiator. And when she's seen, she's always in floods of tears, absolutely heartbroken. Her story goes that she died of heartbreak and grief after she watched her father get killed during one of his fights in the arena. But similarly to so many other ghosts like her, if you see a crying child and you go over to try and help her, she just disappears right in front of you. We don't know specifically who she is or who her father was, but it's a pretty reasonable assumption that there would have been a lot of heartbroken kids left behind after the Colosseum Games. Because, right, okay, they're called games, but it just seems that that's such a light-hearted way of putting what really happened here. Is that just me? But regardless of how I feel or how anyone nowadays feels, the fact is that around 50,000 people would have packed into those stands, and they certainly didn't see it that way at all. To them, it was entertainment. Cheering, laughing, booing, placing bets on who was gonna live or die. And it seems that even now, that energy that they would bring is still there in some capacity. People have described walking into the Colosseum, and just for a split second, they're surrounded by tens of thousands of people in the stands, cheering and clapping as if the next gladiator fight is just about to start. But within an instant, they're gone. And you're just left questioning whether you actually really did just see that or not. But other times, the ghostly crowd isn't seen, but rather heard. That deafening, electric roar of a frenzied audience, cheering and baying for blood, accompanied by the sounds of trumpets and drums, but there's not a soul about. Certainly nothing that would produce that sort of thundering, ear-splitting sound. As far as I know, there aren't speakers or anything in the Colosseum nowadays playing audio from what the place may have sounded like, so there doesn't seem to be an explanation for those sounds. And if that energy of the crowd is still lingering around, it seems like the residual echoes of gladiators are also still there, putting on a show. Figures locked in sword fights have been witnessed on the arena floor, and apparently they look so real and happen during the day that tourists approach them, thinking they're actors hired for reenactments and things, only to find that they disappear when you approach them. But again, sometimes it's just the sounds. The clashing swords, the cries of pain have all been heard echoing around the arena. Or there'll be different sounds, the roars of a lion, the trumpet of an elephant, the growls, the snarls, and the horrible cries of terrified animals fighting to the death for entertainment. But yet again, nothing around, especially nothing that could produce those sounds. So it seems like the animals who suffered at the Colosseum may still be hanging around too, or at least their terrified energy, which is just so sad to think about. There was one story from Reddit where someone described an experience that they had when they visited the Colosseum. And they were walking up these stairs when all of a sudden they were just smacked with this intense feeling of absolutely unbridled fear, just total panic. The kind that can only come from knowing you're about to die, but not really understanding why, like what's happening to you. They carried on walking up the stairs and the feeling just got stronger and stronger. They sensed that it wasn't a human that they were picking up on, and even so, they just couldn't understand why they were getting this feeling here. Like sure, you know the history of the Colosseum and in general what happened here, but in the area where they were, there wouldn't have been condemned prisoners or wild animals being led to the arena. They were just on the staircase up to some spectator stalls. It just didn't make sense. This fear was just carrying on building and building until they got to the top of the stairs and turned the corner. And the first exhibit in that area were the bones of an animal that had been killed in the arena. And after seeing these bones displayed there, that overwhelming fear just disappeared. This person went on to say that nothing else like that happened again. They don't think of themselves as sensitive to energies or anything like that, but it was just, what a profound thing to happen. It's one thing, like I said, to read and learn about what the Colosseum Games were like, and I've tried my best to lay out the absolute horrors that happened here, but nothing would even come close to actually being at the Colosseum and having that same feeling of fear that both man and beast would have been going through just before it was their turn to be turfed out into the arena. And when it's put like that, it seems inevitable that that energy would stay here. And while this particular one just seems like a one-off incident in a stairwell as far as I can tell, there are specific areas in the Colosseum which are notorious for these kinds of experiences. Unsurprisingly, the Hypogeum is one of these spots, the underground part that sat under the arena floor, where wild animals and prisoners were held before their deaths. The palpable fear and panic in this area is so strong that some people have just burst into tears and had to leave. But also, disembodied shouts have been heard, like someone barking orders or quiet weeping coming from a dark corner. Perhaps most creepy are the accounts that visitors visitors have been approached by terrified, half-naked people down in the Hypogeum begging for help, but before they can do anything, they disappear into thin air, leading some people to believe that these are condemned prisoners, desperately trying to escape before they were dragged out into the arena. Another area where strange things are reported is the Porta Libertinaria, the Gate of Death. Ominously called that because this was the archway where the dead and dying were removed from the stage. But at some point, I think up until relatively recently, this was the gate where visitors could enter the Colosseum through. One visitor in 2018 said that just before stepping through this gate, they were suddenly doubled over with the most intense stomach pain that they had ever felt, as if they'd been stabbed or something. It was so bad. The moment they passed through the gate and into the Colosseum, the pain vanished completely. And it wasn't until they reached the end of the tour that they actually learned about the Gate of Death, and that had been the gate they'd used to get inside. So I mean, could be a coincidence, of course, but they just couldn't shake that feeling that they had just experienced some of the trauma left behind by someone who had to use that gate to exit centuries ago. But even though there are specific hotspots here, overall, so many people report the super heavy, oppressive atmosphere from the moment you step inside the Colosseum until the moment you leave. And I mean, yeah, some of that is more than likely because you know what the place was originally used for. You know the stories of brutality that went down here. But there could also be another reason, because by the 9th century, well into the time when the ruin of the Colosseum was being repurposed here and there was a point in time where the arena was actually used as a cemetery. Not really sure how that would have worked and where those people who were interred here ended up, but that's the story. But also that the Colosseum was rumoured to be used for dark rituals, devil worshipping, and possibly even necromancy for centuries afterwards. There was an account from a 16th century sculptor, Benvenuto Cellini, who said that he was invited to take part in a ritual to summon the dead in the Colosseum. The priest drew ritual circles, burned incense, and chanted in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew to call on the demons residing in the Colosseum. Cellini claimed to see thousands of spirits rise from the ruins, slamming against the protective circle that the priest had made, but that also afterwards, 2 devils followed him home. So I mean, however you feel about that encounter and the occult in general, could that have had something to do with it, amplifying the dark history of the place? Not that it needs any amplification, really. I mean, just look at what happened here. It was gruesome. It was barbaric. It was cheered on by tens of thousands of people, and it went on here for centuries. And that leads some paranormal researchers to point to something that people refer to as the stone tape theory. The idea that buildings and objects can somehow absorb the energy of intense events and then replay it. Whether that's possibly what's happening here or not, or even just contributing to the vibe that people feel, the Colosseum absolutely saw enough violence and raw emotion to leave some kind of lasting mark, whether on the stones themselves or simply just hanging in the atmosphere around it. Because sometimes the energy at the Colosseum doesn't just leave you feeling like you're being watched by 1,000 eyes from the stands. It can even reach out and touch you. People often report feeling the sensations of being grabbed by their clothes or feel someone brush past them even though no one's around. Sometimes if you walk from the Hypogeum into the arena, you might feel rough hands on your back as if someone is pushing you to your death in front of the crowd. And even if you've had enough, the Colosseum might not be done with you. People trying to leave have found themselves straining against an invisible force, as if something they can't see is pulling them back inside the building. Just terrifying. Utterly terrifying. No thank you. So maybe that's the thing about the Colosseum. The stone might be cracked, the seats empty, and the arena silent for now, but it was never truly abandoned. Whether it's the ghosts of gladiators still locked in combat, the roar of a crowd that's been dead for nearly 2,000 years, or the icy grip of invisible hands pushing you towards the arena floor, you just can't shake the feeling that you're never alone here. Because the dead are still watching you, watching from the shadows, from the stands, from the dark underground corners, or even just the very walls themselves. And if you go, well, maybe you'll feel their eyes on you too. Or maybe you already have. If you've visited and experienced something a little strange at the Colosseum, please do let us know in the comments. Or if you haven't, just let me know your thoughts on the whole thing. Do you believe that the Colosseum is haunted? And by what? For me, almost all of the stories seem residual in nature, just that strong, lingering energy replaying back. Like the little girl crying for her gladiator father, that would have been one of the most traumatic moments in her life, watching her dad die in front of her. So that being replayed back, I can believe it. That said, a lot of these stories seem to just be grounded in people say, witnesses claim, and so I'd love to hear more first-hand, more verifiable witness reports. I do have a bit of a confession. It sounds so silly now that I've done all of the research and just told you everything I know, but I honestly never thought of the Colosseum being as haunted as it supposedly is. I obviously knew that the history was brutal, I knew about the gladiator fights, the executions, even the wild animals, but I had no idea the sheer scale of the slaughter. But when you stop and think about it like that, it's no wonder staff and visitors still feel like the dead are watching them at the Colosseum. So if you enjoyed this video, enjoyed feels like the wrong word for this particular topic. If you appreciated the information that I told you about, let me know by hitting the like button on this video. And if you want to support me and you like what I'm doing here, the best way you can is by making sure that you are subscribed. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water, stay hydrated. Otherwise, in the Italian heat, you might start seeing things at the Colosseum and they won't be ghosts. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Until Vespasian or Vespasian?